Okay, there we go.
Ready? Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Autism BC talk today. My name is Lindy. I'm the Information Officer of Autism BC. And today we're very glad to have Dr. Glen Davies with us. Dr. Glen Davies is a clinical psychologist and the director of Able Developmental Clinic. He is the recipient of 2019 Nina and Nina Pickburn Award for Outstanding Contribution. The recipient of this award must have demonstrated a dedication to the advancement of autism in our province, combined with a strong sense of purpose and determination. The recipient is somebody whose vision is leading us towards an inclusive society where people on the spectrum can reach their full potential. Welcome to our Autism BC Talk, Dr. Davies. I know you have dedicated over 35 years of your life to clinical and community psychology and have supported thousands of families during some of the most difficult times in their lives. Families and patients describe you as a lifetime support, a helper, and someone who can always be counted on. Can you tell us how you started out involving with autism and the autism community?
Sure, I'd love to. First of all, I'd like to thank Autism BC for the award last year. It was a huge honor. I've been in this field a very long time. 35 years is right. And it was wonderful to be recognized. So thank you for that. Boy, my journey in the area of disabilities really goes back a very long way. It starts when I was a kid myself and had the pleasure of working with some kids who had disabilities. And I really enjoyed that. And it convinced me that that I wanted to work with children in some capacity. So when I went to university, I knew I was going to work with kids. If I got into grad school, my plan was to be a psychologist. If I didn't get into grad school, my plan was to be a teacher. And then when I was in grad school, I decided to do a research project on how parents who have kids with disabilities kind of cope and also thrive with that situation. I met a number of families at that point, and I was so impressed by how they managed what could be very difficult situations, and I wanted to do research that looked more closely at that. And in the process of doing that, I met lots of families, I met lots of agencies serving kids with disabilities, and was offered a job at the Child Development Center in Surrey, even before I finished, right? So I ended up working there for a number of years and worked with a pretty broad range of kids with disabilities. And during that time, I got my doctorate in 1986, and 1987 was when Dr. Lovas published his landmark study that showed that if kids are identified early enough and receive really intensive intervention, that a large proportion of those kids can become indistinguishable from other children. They do so well with early intervention. And that was a complete eye-opener for the field. So I was new in the disability area. And all of a sudden, we were looking at ASD as being a very treatable condition, as opposed to a condition we really didn't know what to do about. So that was very exciting. And so I became more and more interested in autism specifically. I met a researcher named Philip Strain, who was doing a preschool program for children with autism, where he enlisted the support of typically developing kids. It was called a peer-mediated intervention. And so I helped create the LEAP program, which offered that kind of peer-mediated intervention. And that was, really exciting, helpful for most of the kids. But there was one little person in that, in those first years of the program that we just couldn't reach. And at the end of that first year, a family came to me and said, what else is there? What else could we do? It's clearly not working for our little guy. And I said, well, there's this fellow down in UCLA who's said that he can, create these quite amazing results with a form of intensive early intervention called ABA. You could look into that. And so this was one of those families that no time at all, they had packed up, moved to Los Angeles for a year to have their child participate in the early autism project at UCLA with Dr. Lobas. And then they came back to Vancouver and had a consultant, a psychologist who was leading, who trained up local therapists and was providing that intervention. Was one of the very first kids to receive that intervention in BC, or in Canada for that matter. And when I saw it in action, I was blown away. I was blown away at the skill with which they worked with the kids. I was blown away at how they were able to reach a young man that we could not reach with our best efforts. And so at that point, I became a true believer in early intervention and intensive intervention. And that ultimately led, to the Otten court case, where a group of families got together and took the government to court over the lack of these kinds of intervention services. And of course, when the Otten case was won, that led to the funding that we enjoy in BC. And in fact, it led to changes across Canada in the funding of early intervention. And that created a huge demand. And I feel like ever since about 2004, I've been scrambling in one way or another to try to keep up with all of the demands for the kinds of support that little people with ASD and big people as well require. So that's kind of how I got into that field. It was a number of steps along the way, but I certainly look back on it with absolutely no regret.
Yeah, very encouraging story. Very encouraging. But in the last few years, we have noticed an increasing number of adults seeking autism assessment as well from our information and requests. Do you also see that increase in your practice?
Absolutely. And I'd have to say, we've always received requests from time to time to see an adult or to look at doing an assessment for an adult. But I would say in the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years, the number of requests have gone up a lot. And, when I've thought about why that might be, I think there are two things that really are impacting this. And one is just the general increase in autism awareness. And that includes all of the work like what we're doing today and the reaching out within the autism community to, spread information and good, encouraging information, eliminating stigmas, things like that. And very powerful is how autism is portrayed in the media. And in a way, it makes it more mainstream, and we can reach out of the autism community into the general community with awareness. And I think that's had a big impact on the number of individuals that aren't directly connected to autism. In other words, they don't have a brother or sister or child on the spectrum, but they've learned about autism through those sources. And now they see some symptoms in themselves and want to check that out. So I think awareness has made a big impact. The other thing that I think has made a very big impact is over the course of my career, we've gone from a diagnosis of autism happening 1 in 2,500 kids to now 1 in 56 kids. And so that's a 40-fold increase. And that increase has not been with the kids who have the more severe expression of autism. those kinds of kids have not really increased in the prevalence, or they've increased a very small amount. It's the more mild expressions that we've seen, just increase exponentially in terms of our diagnosis rates. And when you are diagnosing these milder expressions of the condition, then more often we're having other family members wondering whether they also might have some of those symptoms, and it tends to lead in that direction a bit more often.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so do you see a shortage of professionals for adult assessment? They're all private, or is the government providing the service through the public system as well? In general speaking, how long is the wait list for getting an adult assessment?
Okay. The answer is most definitely yes, there is a shortage. And one of the things about an adult assessment is that it is really rare that an adult assessment is super straightforward. The rule of thumb is the more severe the disability or the condition, the earlier the diagnosis. So if a child has really, quite significant autism, we're picking that up nowadays, at 18 months or 24 months or really quite young ages. More moderate expressions we're picking up usually in the preschool years. More milder expressions really, during the school years and into adolescence. But if a person has made it all the way to adulthood without a diagnosis, we know for a fact that symptoms are going to be mild, and there might be other things going on. And so it's a little bit of a trickier area for assessment and diagnosis. So you do need some additional skills. Okay. So I think that's, perhaps contributes to the shortage of professionals who work in this area. In terms of public options, we really only at this time have the only publicly funded option is through the medical services plan. And so if a family is consulting or an adult is consulting with a psychiatrist, that psychiatrist's fees are paid for under the medical plan. And so that would be publicly funded. And we really just have a handful of psychiatrists who practice in that area, and some of them, some very, very skilled ones, are later in their careers and are not seeing that many families at this point. Dr. Anthony Bailey, for one, has done a tremendous amount of work in this area, and so we're seeing a shortage becoming almost critical within the public area. Personally, I'd love to see something happen at the Pacific Autism Family Network. We have a lot of the resources there that could be marshaled or brought together to provide an adult assessment service of some kind. And the biggest piece that's missing from that isn't the expertise right now, it's actually the funding for that. If an adult has ASD, this is a bit of a generalization, but many of the adults that have approached us about an adult assessment, they don't have a ton of money in order to pay for that. And so it would be wonderful if there was some core funding that would allow us to do that assessment without a big cost, right?
Right.
There are a number of private options for adult assessments, and the downside of that, of course, is there are fees for that. Psychology is not covered under the medical plan, and it is covered under some extended health plans or other employee assistance programs. So a family may have some funding that they could use. But we have 5 or 6 psychologists at Able Clinic that have an interest in adult assessment, so we have some capacity in that area. And there are other private clinics in Vancouver and BC as well that do see adults. And I just, coming back from holidays, I had intended to try to give you a short list of some of those clinics, but I'll get that to you afterwards.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
But in general, how long do you see like the wait list for getting an assessment? Months, years?
Well, I think, we're pretty similar, I think, to other private clinics where it's a matter of a few months to several months,
Okay.
But not years.
Okay.
So we work very hard not to get to the point where people are having to wait this, crazy amounts of time in order to answer a question like this.
Yes.
One of the ways that we've worked hard to try to keep within a reasonable time frame is that we've been growing about 10% per year. We've been recruiting and training and bringing people on board to try to keep up with the demand. And so we've become an internship training site,
right.
really with a very not very well hidden agenda to try to keep these interns with us and staying in the field and joining our capacity, increasing our capacity. And we've been providing training through Pacific Autism Family Network and Able Clinic and UBC. We've been collaborating for the last 3 years to provide training in assessment and diagnosis for the province at large. And so we've done 2 live trainings. This year, of course, we're having to do it through video. And we've arranged for Dr. Adam McPrimmon from Alberta to lead a training session in September, October. Not specific to adults, but it will include an adult section. So we keep working at trying to, increase capacity, for our own clinic, of course, for the Pacific Autism Family Network, but also for the province at large. We see it as a provincial shortage and would love to see us have more capacity.
Yeah, that's actually a good news that more people are getting trained to do that. But do you see a services gap for adults on the spectrum in terms of like therapy, support, and funding? And what can we do as a community to improve the situation?
Oh, absolutely. Huge gaps for adults. And, I think we have some support and funding for children. It's more generous till children turn 6. It's less generous after 6. In many ways, it's not enough. We know it's not enough. But when an individual turns 19, autism funding provincially ends, and autism doesn't end at 19. We all know that, right? For the vast majority of folks with this condition, it's it is a lifelong condition, and so needs continue into the adult years. And so, in terms of general support, Autism BC, Autism Support Network, Pacific Autism Family Network, ANCA, lots of different organizations try to provide support for adults. They're doing a great job doing that. It would be nice if it was more generously funded. It's a lot of work. I think that the funding issue is a very big issue in the adult world. If a family, or if the child becoming an adult has a significant level of disability, they may be eligible for support with Community Living BC, which is the Crown agency in British Columbia responsible for adults with disabilities. The persons or the Personalized Supports Initiative requires an autism diagnosis and a measure of adaptive behavior that has to be very low. A standard score of 55, which is a very, very low score to meet. I think that it's too low, but nonetheless, that means that some families can get support through CLBC. And then if an individual qualifies for the Persons with Disability Income Allowance, a disability allowance that can also be applied to support services and to some intervention services as well. But the funding dropping off at 19 is really a problem. The needs don't change, right? They don't drop off.
Totally.
In terms of a gap for therapy, it is easier in our province to find professionals interested in working with little people than it is for professionals working with older people. It's unfortunate. The needs are there. And there's lots of information that the same tools that we use for children apply equally for adults. And so the National Autism Center in the US prepares a national standards report. The last version of that included some really strong review of evidence for the role of intervention for adults. So we know the research is there. What's missing is the funding to put those strategies in place. In terms of what we as a community can do to help, I think a very small programmatic change with Community Living BC would be tremendously beneficial, and that would be simply to move the requirement for adaptive behavior from 55 to 70, which moves from 3 standard deviations below the mean to 2 standard deviations below the mean. Sounds like not a big thing in terms of numbers, but it moves from 0.1% of the population to 2% of the population, and brings it in line with the line in the sand that we typically use to consider a disability. If your functioning level is in that lower 2%, for sure your needs are significant. And so that would be one small, it sounds like a small procedural change, but it would quadruple the number of individuals on the spectrum who would qualify for those very relevant and helpful supports. And I think that we are lucky in BC to have a provincial Center of Excellence for Autism. And if we could get some government funding towards adult services, I know the Pacific Autism Family Network would be delighted to provide whatever kinds of supports that families are interested in. And I think the other part of it comes back to what the Autism BC is doing and other parent organizations, and that's awareness. As awareness goes up, identification goes up, and stigma goes down. And more and more adults come forward for help, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. So we have heard of stories, as you said, that parents are looking for assessment after they found out that the children are getting an autism diagnosis. So among the adult assessments in your practice, you see a trend like this as well?
Absolutely, and more so recently, especially, where we get involved or requested to provide an assessment for a child and go through that process, and then through the process, one of the parents either self-declares, or sometimes their spouse says, I think my husband or wife may have some of these symptoms, and it can lead in that direction. And certainly what I've found is that some of our clinicians are more comfortable broaching that subject, and some are less comfortable. And so we have a pediatrician working with us now who, if she sees in the parents some of the symptoms, then she's very upfront in mentioning that to families, and that has led to a number of families pursuing an adult assessment. Other clinicians really wait for the family to ask them, right? Rather than
Right.
broach that subject. They're there for their child, stay with the child, but it does come up, and it comes up more often recently.
So will treatment plan be very different if you have, parent and child both got the diagnosis, or do you need specialized professionals to help with these families?
That's a really good question, and it's one where I have to say we're not well prepared. Um, One area that I am aware of is, for instance, in the area of ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's also a condition where there's some genetic risk. So if a child is diagnosed with ADHD, it's more likely that one or both parents may have some ADHD. Also true in the autism area. And so with that increased likelihood, it's not that unusual to be working with a family with ADHD, where one of the parents also has ADHD. And so there's some research and some specific parent training programs, for instance, that are designed to fit if one of the parents or both of the parents have ADHD. We don't have that in the ASD area, but your question really got me thinking about that, thinking we really should, right? But we do have some guidance that I think would be helpful for clinicians who find themselves in a situation where one of the parents also is on the spectrum. Wonderful book by Angela Scarpa and Tony Atwood called Cognitive Behavior Therapy for High Functioning Individuals with ASD. Includes in one of the first chapters a number of the adaptations that you would want to make as a clinician working with someone on the spectrum. And that includes things like that were more explicit or directive rather than, indirect or too metaphorical in our speech, that we use visuals a little bit more than we might do otherwise, and that we provide lots of written summaries, that words back and forth between people are in thin air. They disappear when the conversation ends. And we know that in working with kids on the spectrum, adolescents on the spectrum, this is also true in working with adults on the spectrum, simply recounting what we talked about in written form, the person can go back to, is tremendously helpful. So there are little tools that we can borrow from our information on working with adolescents on the spectrum, also valuable for working with adults on the spectrum, also valuable for working with parents who are adults on the spectrum. So I think there are things that we can do, but we really don't have a special, some specialized research in this area or clear guidance, not that I'm aware of.
I see. But we know not only adult assessment is facing a long wait list, but children assessment on the wait list is over 68 weeks through the public system now. And is it a shorter wait list if we go private for children assessment?
The wait lists privately are always shorter than the public wait lists. I don't know why a family would want to go public or go privately if in fact we had really timely, good quality publicly funded assessments, right? It wouldn't make sense.
Right.
But the public assessments have always struggled to keep up. And even before the COVID crisis, we were looking at delays of more than a year. During COVID, all of the assessment services, private and public, were shut down for a period. Most of the services got back doing the parts of assessments that they could do by telehealth, by video, and by telephone sometimes, parent interviews, for example. But parts of them need to be done in person. And some of the private clinics were quicker to get back to seeing children in person, with all of the appropriate, PPE and protocols and sanitizing and so on. It's cumbersome, but it can be done. But I think that the publicly funded services were a little bit slower to get back. I think they're just starting up now in terms of doing the in-person components of those assessments. So we had pretty long waiting lists to begin with. We lost a couple of months, and now going back in order to stagger when people are in the clinics or the hospitals so that they're not bumping into each other, having enough time between appointments to fully sanitize the office and all of the hundreds of little materials the children manipulate during an autism assessment. All of those things mean that the services are coming back with less capacity than we were before. So that will just have an impact of lengthening these waiting lists. So, you know, they were behind to begin with, they lost time through the shutdown, and now we're coming back with all of these restrictions that mean that we are having a harder time keeping up. So, you know, in our clinic, we worked really hard to try to increase our capacity so that our wait lists don't keep expanding. So we've added some clinical staff. We've purchased a number of the test kits, additional test kits, so that we can use the test kits and put them aside, clean them up later, because it takes a long time to clean, particularly for the younger children. There are, you know, hundreds of bits of pieces. They all have to be dipped in a sanitizing bath, or, you know, it's an ordeal, right? So, and then again, we're providing training. So we're trying to build capacity, whether it's people seeing clinicians at our clinic or other clinics. We need to build capacity because it's hard to work as efficiently under these circumstances.
Yeah, but like how long are we looking at if we're going through ABLE for an assessment?
Well, we've been able to keep our waiting lists between 3 and 6 months at this point. And we're working hard at trying to keep it at that level. And so far we've been able to maintain. It's creeping up a little bit, but we're trying really hard.
Yes,
but and you know, during the early days of the COVID crisis, I had many conversations with autism policy folks through the Ministry for Children and Family Development to encourage them to waive some of the requirements during these exceptional times.
I see.
There's parts of the autism assessment that have to be done in person, you know, up close and personal with a little person on the spectrum manipulating materials together, and you can't be both wearing masks, right? And gowns, right? You know, it ends up looking like a kind of a hazmat play date. It's, you know, you cannot get a reliable measure of social engagement, you know, with all of these precautions in place. We do our best, but it's not ideal. There are some other tools out there that involve standardized observations of kids at home, where you ask families to set up particular circumstances, and we have a standardized way to measure symptoms under those circumstances. And those show a good relationship with our typical autism assessment tools. And you know, I personally think it would have made a lot of sense right from the beginning of the pandemic to during the pandemic to simply allow us to use those home observation tools in place of some of these in-person things. Right. And if the government felt more comfortable making that a provisional diagnosis, so be it. We can get started at helping. The other components can be added later, but don't delay access to treatment because of this, it's hard enough, right? To have
Right.
a person and you're worried about whether they're on the spectrum, and then to wait a year or 2 years and miss all of those critical months of
Right.
potential treatment for a procedural reason, not good enough.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But my next question is, we often come across the question of, shall I tell my child he or she has autism? When should I disclose it to her? Or how should I communicate it to our children? So Dr. Davis, from your expert point of view, what would you tell these parents?
Well, I would say mostly yes. That much more often than not, it's better to tell than to withhold this information. And we share that advice with families, but we also always respect the family's choice in this matter. So we don't push or insist, but we do encourage, and we do point out that there is some research to show that it's usually beneficial to discuss this with kids. The only time I would say that I don't think it's necessary is if a young person is picked up very young, has intensive intervention, and does so well that they're indistinguishable from other kids, then there's really no need to tell. It was a period of time in their history. They're not having ongoing needs. They're I would say at that point, okay, I'm willing to say let's leave it in the past. But most of the time, there are some residual needs.
Mm.
There are some differences that continue, even if those differences are a bit subtle. And I think in terms of when parents tell, some parents choose early. And if they talk with their kids when their kids are really young, the kids just sort of go, okay. It's just matter of fact. It's just, the term autism doesn't have a lot of meaning to a little person. It is what you tell them it is. And it's the way you describe it and your comfort with it and the metaphors you use to talk about the symptoms that will be what the child hears. So early discussion, it's kind of a non-event for the kids. It just becomes part of their awareness. Other parents choose to wait until the child asks questions, and questions come up. And then I encourage parents, if they want to pursue that timing, that they be prepared. It will come. It usually does come. And kind of have an idea of what they want to do or say based on the age or maturity of their child. But oftentimes the question will come up. So be ready for it. And then some, parents wait until they feel that their child will have the overall maturity to really understand what autism is, or what this condition is, or why they were the recipients of intervention. And they want their children to have a better grasp of the whole picture before they have that discussion. And I can understand the desire to do that, but at the same time, it's often hard to determine when that golden moment is if the child doesn't ask the questions. And also, I would have to say, in the vast majority of circumstances, the parents are much more stressed out about this conversation than the children are. And it's anticlimactic for most families when they finally do it. Their kids go, oh, okay, well, I kind of wondered about that. Or, I know that there's another person at school who has autism, or, the kids generally take it in stride without big reactions.
I see.
So we do encourage parents to talk.
Very good advice. Very good advice. Yeah. We certainly see an improvement in autism awareness and acceptance from, like, say, 35 years ago when you first started out and when we first started out. However, we still are very far from being fully inclusive. Like, what is your opinion on this, and what can we do to help to achieve that goal?
Okay. Well, first of all, over the 35 years that I've been in this field, the changes have been fantastic. They've been dramatic. So there's a part of me that, because of my time frame being so long and knowing what it was like many, many years ago, I tend to look at the situation a little bit more as the glass is half full. We're so much further ahead than where we were. But it is true that the glass is also partly empty, that, inclusion is not complete, awareness is not complete. And I think my biggest advice would be to keep doing what you're doing, what Autism BC is doing, what Autism Canada is doing, what other autism organizations are doing, which is keep putting the word out, keep building awareness, keep talking about autism and being open about autism and being accurate in the diversity of expressions of autism, right? And as this awareness has increased, the media has also joined the party, and so we see more and more articles, news stories, television series, movies that depict autism, and they are depicting autism in better and better ways than they used to. And the media serves a tremendous role in reaching outside of the autism community to other people. And it's getting those other people on board that, and then being supportive of the autism world at large, that builds political support, right? The autism community, we've already got their votes, right? We know that. We need the support of people outside of the autism community to implement things like a true national autism strategy. We need all Canadians to get behind that, right? And so the media plays a huge role in that, and lots of good stuff is happening now. And I guess my other little bit of advice really comes down to no matter where we are in this continuum, for organizations like Autism BC to never stop asking and demanding for more. Okay, there's always more that a school board or a school or a healthcare system or a government can do to improve the lot for individuals with disabilities and for individuals with ASD. So at the end of the day, if we look back on the evolution of services for individuals with disabilities and for autism, the vast majority of good stuff that's happened in the last 35 years has been done by parents. I got honored with an award last year. I really appreciate it, but I know that the driving force behind all positive change in the area of disabilities is almost always led back to a small group of parents who get a bee in their bonnet and go after a significant change. It doesn't start with the professionals. It doesn't start with the politicians. It starts with the parents. You guys are the catalyst to get the rest of us moving in the right direction. So.
Yeah, thank you. Very good advice. So now we have a few questions from the floor. Emily is asking, how does autism affect girls differently?
Great question. Thank you for that one. Yeah, it's a hot topic right now in the field, and it was one that was largely overlooked for most of the time that I've been in the field. And if we look at how autism was described and even how it was diagnosed in the earlier days, there was a huge sex difference where autism was diagnosed 5 to 10 times as often in boys than in girls. And all of the descriptions of what it was like to have autism tended to be male biased. That's how boys with autism tended to present. And girls with autism, when we have more sensitive ways of picking up, and we're more focusing a little bit more on the higher end of the spectrum, what we realize is that the sex difference between boys and girls is nowhere near as biased as we used to think. We don't have perfect data in this, but it's probably more like 2 to 1 rather than 10 to 1. So the boys still outnumber the girls, but there are lots of girls with this condition, and they tend to be a bit more mild in the expression, and they tend to do something that in the field has been described as masking, that they can fake it better, that they can mask their symptoms better, and that girls tend to be a little bit more socially motivated than the boys and work harder at trying to fit in and study their circle of friends more closely, adopt more of those social skills and social norms, and work much harder to try to fit in and be okay. And so what we see with the girls is that they tend to be more successful at masking their symptoms, and therefore tend to be picked up a little bit later.
Right.
So, but there's some good resources coming out now. There's some good guidance to the field about being more sensitive to the way that autism presents with girls. Some good books coming forward. So the field is improving quickly in this area. And we've had Dr. Chris Gilberg from Sweden present a few times in Vancouver in recent years, and this is an area of interest for him. And so, he's a good source for scientific information on boys and girls and how they differ in presentation.
Yeah, thank you. And we've got another question from Amara Wood. It's regarding an assessment for 11 years old who has moved from another province and has not been followed by a doctor in BC. So no early intervention record. How does one play catch up with this juncture?
Okay, we do have a system in BC that allows us to do what's called a confirmation of diagnosis. So, Amara, if your child is assuming it's a son, if your son has had any kind of assessment in another province or another country, whatever information you have, you can share with a BC, what's called a qualified specialist, a person who's licensed in BC to provide these kinds of diagnoses. And they can look at what's been done, and if it's sufficient, in other words, it's relatively equivalent to what we do in BC, then it's just a matter of that person filling in a very brief form. It's quick and easy. They review the information, fill in the form, and that will allow access to BC supports, and including autism funding. If there's a shortfall in information, then we have to make up that shortfall. And so it might be some components of the assessment, and in some circumstances, it may be the whole assessment that needs to be done. And we have quite strict guidelines in BC about what we must do in order to qualify. Other jurisdictions have their own guidelines. Some are relatively strict. Most of them are less strict. And so, there can be a discrepancy, and again, we have to sort of level the playing field a little bit.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And we've got a question from Emily. What about children who need a lot of intervention and support after they turn 6? Like, why do you think funding is cut so drastically? Should we consider a need-based model rather than an age-based model?
Oh, there's no way that I would ever support our policy of dropping from $22,000 a year to 6. I am aware of the rationale that the government used at that point in time. It was largely based on the fact that the rest, in quotation marks, of the funding would be flowing to the school districts to provide that support. And again, the school districts get about $19,000 a year of additional funding for every child who's identified on the spectrum. And so the government's rationale was most of the work is going to be while the child's in school. We're providing funding for school-based autism services. So we only need to provide a small amount for home-based services, and that's the $6,000. Mm-hmm. The other part of the rationale, I think, is around the importance of early intervention and to some extent, a lot of the pressure on the government to do something in the autism world came back to those studies of intensive early intervention and the importance of it. And that does, in fact, make dramatic differences for a large number of children. And we're glad we do that. And $22,000 is not enough to do that. I'd like to see it be more than that. Twice that would be a good start. But when it drops to $6,000, it doesn't make any sense. There's nothing magic about that. The needs continue through the school years for sure, and like we were talking about earlier, into adulthood. Yeah. So having age-based decisions with a condition that doesn't move in any predictable fashion by age doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And to some extent, services should probably always have some needs-based formula. Measuring that need can be challenging at times. To some extent, the fact that we have a diagnosis-based entitlement is helpful. So if you get a diagnosis, you get the funding. You don't have to justify beyond that. Mm-hmm. But certainly there are very many kids 6 years and older who could benefit from the $22,000 in addition to the $19,000 that the school district's getting. So I think it doesn't make sense. But.
Yeah. Thank you. And we've got another question. Is there any advocacy being done to change that adaptive functioning that you mentioned, score of 55? It's like just too low.
I know that when CLBC started, there was a lot of pressure, once again, coming back to parents with children with autism, higher functioning kids with autism, saying that there are kids' real life functioning. They may have a high IQ, but their real life functioning is still significantly impaired, and in many ways quite similar to the needs of other children with disabilities, other young adults with disabilities. And so they lobbied Community Living BC and the government and got the Personalized Supports Initiative program to happen. And so in the early going, this was a brand new program, and the CLBC had to make an arbitrary decision about where to draw the line in the sand. We've always used the line of 70 to define an intellectual disability, and also to define a level of adaptive behavior disability. If you are in that lower 2%, it is a significant area of impairment, right? That's low enough. So it would have made sense to draw the line in the sand at 70 at that point in time. I think for a new program, I understood that they wanted to get it up and operational. They needed to have a manageable number of kids in those first years. Okay, start low, I understand, okay. But it's been low a very long time. This program, I think, is it's between 15 and 20 years old now. It shouldn't be that low. It could easily be put in line with other standards, and 70 is still a big challenge.
Right.
So.
Okay, got it. So we need to talk to the stakeholder, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Definitely. Okay. So another question is COVID-19 and in-person intervention challenges. Can ABA or other therapy be done virtually?
Wow, good question. Right now, nearly all of the intervention has a virtual component. And is there a lot of research on virtual ABA or virtual interventions? The answer, there really wasn't. There's some research. Most of it is favorable, but precious little. And so COVID caught us off guard for sure. And I think that where most of the field is right now is a combination of virtual and in-person. And I think that the behavior interventionist, the paraprofessional who's going to work directly with the child, I think still needs to work directly with the child. Older kids, adolescents, adults, you can do practically everything virtually. But for younger children, a talking head on a video screen is just not compelling enough, right? So I think that the BIs still need to be in person. And what I've been recommending to families is keep your bubble as small as possible. You may have had 3 BIs coming in and out of your home in the past. Condense that down to 1 BI who maintains their safety and the rest of their life, but they're part of your family bubble because you need the hands-on part. The behavior consultant, the behavior analyst, they can do most of their job remotely. They can advise the BI, they can advise the parents, they can observe what's going on through video, they can coach the BI by video. That can all work quite effectively, but somewhere there has to be some hands and some direct interaction, and it's hard for me. Again, the younger the child, the more difficult it is to really engage them in a video teaching.
Right. Totally.
I've seen some very resourceful. Some of our speech pathologists are doing an amazing job making a video conference format into a compelling and engaging exchange with the children. But, there's a lot that really needs people power, and it's hard to work around.
Yeah, agree. Yeah, so I think that's all for the question now, but thank you, Dr. Davies, for joining us today. We have learned so much from you from this talk, but if you have, from the floor, anybody have any question, just send it to Autism BC or contact us directly and we will chase after Dr. Davies for an answer. And just before we leave, just a reminder to everybody, our nomination for the BC Autism Award for 2020 is right now on. Please go to our website for details and nominate your hero today. That's it for now. Until next time, see you. And thank you very much again, Dr. Davies, for being here today. Thank you.
My pleasure. And thank you, Lindy.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.